Our scripture today comes from Matthew 2, 1 through 12, New Revised Standard Version. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all of the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judea. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I also may pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road.
Well, today I've got to say that I'm actually really excited about this sermon today because we are beginning a sermon series that's actually going to take us to almost Easter. And this sermon series is one that a number of people have actually asked me about and that I've been looking forward to taking on for quite a while now. We are going to be looking at Jesus' early beginnings of his ministry and what is arguably his most important and significant teaching, which is the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is a fairly long sermon. It's really his longest public sermon that's recorded in the Gospels, and it covers all of chapters 5, 6, and 7 in the Gospel of Matthew. And it really gives us an amazing window into who Jesus is and what he really expects of people who would follow him. The importance of the Sermon on the Mount really can't be understated, particularly for those of us who come from our stream of Christianity. This whole series is going to be based on several assumptions that are a part of our way of viewing the Bible and viewing the world. And they're fairly simple and straightforward assumptions, but taken together, they're actually kind of unique. Those assumptions are that we believe that Jesus meant what he said, that he wasn't kidding. Second is that he was talking to us, particularly to his disciples. That's us. And third is the assumption that we're actually going to attempt to do what he said. Now, those seem fairly simple, but in our tradition, they are fairly unique. Now, if those things are our goal, it raises a couple of other questions, which are, okay, well, who is this guy then? Who is this Jesus guy really? And, well, what did he actually tell people to do? We may think that we know, but what really did he tell his followers to do? The Sermon on the Mount is actually a fairly good place to start in order to answer those questions. In order to do that, we are going to go back in the story a little bit before the Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting is that before the Sermon on the Mount, there isn't a whole lot that really happens. It's just a couple of stories about the beginning of his ministry, and And then all of a sudden you get to his birth, and you get to the story of the Magi. So this morning, we're going to start with the story of the Magi coming to visit Jesus. And if we're going to do that, that means we're kind of getting back to the Christmas story. And if we're going to do that, well, we need to clear up a couple of misconceptions about the Christmas story. First of all, if you were to imagine the birth of Jesus, the image that pops into most of our heads is actually a surprisingly uniform image. It's one that we all kind of think of. It's the nativity scene, right? And it's a pretty standardized kind of scene. You basically have Jesus lying in a manger, which is a cattle trough, right in the middle of the whole thing. Then you have Mary and Joseph kneeling next to them usually. Then on one side you've got sheep and shepherds, and on the other side, well, you have wise men and some camels. And then above the stable you've got a star and some angels floating around, right? I mean, that's sort of the nice little image. It fits really well on a postcard kind of thing. So I got some bad news for you. That didn't happen. Not even close. That image, what we think of as the nativity scene, well, that came into existence in the year 1223 with St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis is the one who sort of constructed that image that we think of as the nativity about 800 years ago. And to be fair, he did it for some really good reasons. He felt that in his day and age that people had, when it comes to the Christmas season and celebrating Christmas, he felt that people had become too consumed with materialism and gift-giving. And so he wanted to turn attention back to Jesus, which seems really familiar in not a good way. So he created this nativity scene, and it sort of took off and went from there. Unfortunately, the nativity scene is constructed. Part of the problem here is that St. Francis basically took two different stories from within the Bible about the birth of Jesus and kind of put them together. The part of the story that has all of the shepherds and the angels and the manger and all of that comes from the Gospel of Luke. Whereas the wise men and the star, well, that comes from the Gospel of Matthew. They're not even in the same book of the Bible together. What's more, the timing is off. The shepherds may have been there the night of his birth, but the wise men, it doesn't really say. There's some implications that it could be anywhere up to 2 years after Jesus was born. It's just not likely that they were there at the same time. And speaking of those wise men, yeah, I've got some more bad news for you. There's a lot of information that has been tacked on to the tradition about the wise men that just isn't in the scriptures. In the Western church, there's a whole bunch of details that have been added about the wise men and who they were and what they looked like. There's, according to tradition, they have names and descriptions. That you have Melchior, who is supposed to be an older man with white hair of some sort. Then you have Casper, who is supposed to be a younger man with a red-haired complexion. And then you've got Balthazar, who is a heavily bearded black man. The problem is, none of that's in the Bible. You don't even know if there are three of them. We just assume that there were three wise men because there are three gifts that are listed. The number of the wise men is not listed at all. And about that name, wise men, or particularly kings, probably weren't kings. Most likely, the only reason that we assume that they were kings is because of the wealth or the extravagance or the expensiveness of the gifts. The assumption is that only a king could have afforded those kinds of gifts. In the Bible, the word that is used to describe them is actually Magi. Now that word is interesting because that gets us a little closer to who these people really were and actually what the significance of their visit in this story really is. The name Magi or Magi, M-A-G-O-I, is an interesting term. One of the commentaries that I read in some of the research that I did for this sermon talked about how that term, Magi, was really a term that started off referring to a fairly specific class of priests or religious leaders among several different people groups, like the Medes or the Persians. Over time, the word Magi kind of expanded a little bit to mean anybody who practiced special religious powers or maybe even occult powers. So people like astrologers or fortune tellers, dream interpreters, magicians, sorcerers, that kind of thing. In the case of the biblical Magi, most likely they were astrologers. But it is worth noting here that what that really means is that these people who came to visit Jesus were religious leaders of some sorts. They were people who had essentially taken their religious wisdom and knowledge as far as it could go, and they had interpreted these events that they saw in the stars to have significant meanings. They would have most likely believed that the movements of the stars had real-world significance because of God's or the God's actions. They were signs of divinely appointed events. And interestingly, these people, these Magi, interpret the movements of these stars to have significant meaning for their neighbors, who were the Jews. Which means that you have a bunch of non-Jewish people seeing a significant event coming for the Jews. And they head out across the desert in order to go worship the King of the Jews, or the new coming King of the Jews. And it's that term, King of the Jews, that also brings another interesting element into this story. In the way that this story is written in the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi are set in a very stark contrast to Herod and some of the other Jewish leaders. Part of the problem here is that the term King of the Jews was kind of already taken. Herod was an interesting guy. He was at least partly Jewish, probably on his mother's side, from what we can find out, which is also confusing and somewhat troubling considering the fact that he had worked his way up through the Roman governmental structure in order to become a ruler of one of the Roman regions, which was Palestine or Israel. And interestingly, that position, that regional ruler over Israel, Palestine, was often known as the King of the Jews. Herod is also something of a paranoid guy. He was really willing to do anything and everything to eliminate any competition that he had for his political power and his political control. Which is why, when these Magi come, these religious leaders, they come telling him that they are looking for the new King of the Jews that they have seen foretold in the stars, that is the divinely inspired event, that this new King of the Jews is coming. And Herod gets nervous. The word is afraid in English. In Greek, it's more closer to terrified. Herod is really scared at this point. And interestingly, it says that all of Jerusalem was scared with him. So there's a connection there between the other Jewish leaders and Herod. At which point, Herod calls the Jewish scholars out and basically says, hey, I'm hearing this from these foreigners. Is this true? And they look up in the Old Testament prophecies and they say, well, yeah, probably. And it's probably happening in this town, in this place, which only makes Herod even more nervous. And if you want to see just how far Herod is willing to go to eliminate Jesus and to eliminate his competition, just read on from our scripture. There's a pretty disturbing story that comes after this visit from the Magi. And now we come to the main point, or one of the main points of this story. There are some significant things that this story is trying to communicate to its readers or its hearers, some of which have to do with who Jesus is and what kind of king he is. But one of the other significant points of this story really has to do with this contrast between Herod and the Magi. In this story, it is the Magi, the Gentiles, the foreigners, the non-Jewish people who are seeking out the Jewish Messiah. the King of the Jews, the new king of the world. And yet it is Herod and the other Jewish leaders who are terrified at the very same prospect of that Messiah. The Magi most likely were not particularly familiar with the Hebrew tradition and the Hebrew scriptures. And yet they are the ones who are seeking out Jesus, willing to walk across a desert in order to worship him. It is Herod and the other Jewish leaders who do know the scriptures. And yet they miss what God is doing through Jesus. And when they do find out what God is doing, they are terrified and they push Jesus away. In this story, it's really the outsiders who get it right. And it's the insiders who get it wrong. One of the key messages of this story is that the people who should have known about Jesus and should have welcomed him with open arms, they are the ones who reject him. And yet it is the ones who should know nothing about Jesus who are the ones who pursue him and look for him and ultimately wind up worshiping him properly. This story tells us something about who Jesus is, but it also tells us something pretty key about how the people of God missed what God was doing through Jesus. And it is worth asking here why they missed what God was doing through Jesus, because when we ask that question, we also get some interesting answers here. To be fair, the Jewish community at that point was not uniform. There were different groups, different factions of leaders and people within the community that had a different take on what they thought should be done, particularly in relation to the Roman occupation. There were some leaders, some priests, who basically cooperated with the Romans and tried to hang on to their power by making concessions and a whole number of other things. This is probably who Herod is most closely connected with. There was also a group of people called the Zealots who wanted to overthrow the Romans by force and to lead a revolt. Then you have a group of people called the Essenes who just pulled out of society altogether and made this hermit community way out in the middle of nowhere and said, we're just going to wash our hands of all of it. Now, interestingly, when Jesus comes on the scene, by the end of the story, you find out that Jesus really is not like any of these different communities or different factions. And on some level, he makes all of them pretty nervous and pretty upset. Now, even though all of these different groups existed within the Jewish community, they did have sort of a thread that tied them all together. In their own way, in one form or another, they were all basically attempting to preserve their culture or their ethnicity. They were trying to hang on to their institutions and their control and their power. One way to say it is that all of these different Jewish groups had become caught up in their own institutions and control and power and ethnicity and all of that stuff that gets tacked onto religion. And they had failed to notice what God was doing through Jesus. The story of the visit of the Magi holds a pretty powerful message, particularly when you hold the Jewish reaction and the Magi reaction together. One key message of this story is that the early Christians and us today should be more like the Magi and less like Herod. The message is really a call to pursue Jesus above everything else. And it's a message that, I think we need to hear over and over again, because the reality is that as individuals and as a church, we're not either Herod or the Magi. We're both Herod and the Magi, right? I mean, we have this tension that we all have to struggle with. On one hand, there are times where we will boldly and confidently say that, yes, we want to follow Jesus with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we'll do anything that we can to do that. And then there are other times where we get caught up in all of this other stuff that's gotten tacked on to our expression of following Jesus over the years. The struggle that we all face is that we all want to follow Jesus, but we don't do that in a vacuum. We do that in the context of real life. And we are people. We're broken, we're kind of messed up people trying to follow Jesus. That's really why the church accumulates this extra baggage over time that doesn't necessarily have to do that much with following Jesus. And for that matter, that's why the Jews accumulated the same kind of baggage over time by the time Jesus was born. And here's kind of what I mean by that. In the early history of the Jewish people, they followed God wherever God led them. They were nomadic people. They wandered around the desert. They didn't have a really clear understanding of who God was and what they were doing. They made a lot of mistakes. But nevertheless, they were following God wherever God went. Now, over time, there were all kinds of different things that developed in order to help them follow God more fully. There were some rules and some laws, and there were special people that were designated to help them understand what God was saying. They're called priests, and you've got the temple. You've got all these different things that are essentially intended to help the people more fully follow God. The problem is that by the time Jesus showed up, well, the people had gotten caught up in all of that other stuff, and they'd forgotten the core of why they started doing it in the first place. And I think the same thing happens with us as individuals and as the church, the broader church. There are things throughout our history that we sort of pick up along the way that at one point are helpful and do help us to follow Jesus more fully. For some churches, it's different kinds of things for different churches. For some churches, it's a particular set of rituals or a particular liturgy. For some churches, it's a particular set of songs or a style of worship. For others, it's an institutional structure or a whole host of other things, all of which were helpful at one point in time, but over the years, it's easy to become overly attached to all of those other things. And we can forget why we started doing those things in the first place. It's something that can happen even within the Church of the Brethren, which is kind of ironic considering how our denomination or how our tradition began. In the early 1700s, there were 8 brethren who got together and baptized each other in the river, in the Schwarzenau River. And why they did that is really fascinating. They basically had looked at the other churches that were around, the other forms of Christianity that were there, and they said essentially that those churches had accumulated all of this baggage, all of this other stuff, and they were getting caught up in that, and they had forgotten to follow Jesus. And so these 8 brethren said, we want to get back to Jesus. We want to strip away all of that baggage, find out who Jesus is, and follow him above everything else. An example of what I mean by that. One of the key phrases that still describes who brethren are is that we have no creed except for the New Testament. We're called a non-creedal church. We have no creed except for the New Testament. Creeds are essentially a statement of belief or statement of faith about Jesus and sometimes about the church. When they came into existence a couple thousand years ago, they were helpful. They helped people understand who Jesus was more fully, and they helped people follow him more fully. By the time the brethren showed up, however, there were many churches that had gotten caught up on the creeds and who had focused solely on that and who had forgotten to follow Jesus. They were tied up in the creeds. In fact, they worshiped the creeds more than they even worshiped the scriptures. And so the brethren got together and began as an attempt to peel away all of that other baggage. Alexander Mack and these other brethren said that they wanted to pursue Jesus above everything else. What's interesting is that even with that kind of a beginning, over the years within our tradition, different rituals and practices, things that are intended to help us follow Jesus, they creep into the tradition. And we find ourselves with things that are embedded that maybe sometimes distract from following Jesus. It's interesting, as I studied some Brethren history this past fall, there's been this process throughout the last couple of hundred years where it seems like every generation has to discover Jesus again for themselves. It's a cyclical kind of thing that we start off looking for Jesus and sort of peeling away that baggage that comes along, and then the next generation has to sort of do the same thing. The message of our scripture is essentially that we are called to search for Jesus, to pursue him, to know him, to follow him, and to love him above everything else. And we are fortunate to be part of a stream of Christianity that was founded on doing just that. It is part of our brethren DNA to be willing to strip it all away and to go back to Jesus, to learn who he is and follow that above everything else. We did it in the beginning, we've done it over time, and over the next couple of months, that's essentially what we're going to be doing again. Our goal is to pursue Jesus, to find out who he really was, and to find out what he actually did teach his followers to do, and to make an attempt to actually do what he taught. Essentially, we're going to try and lay down some of the baggage that has accumulated over the years and refocus ourselves on Jesus. Another way to say it is that we are embarking on a journey down a particular path. It's a path that has been walked before by brethren that have gone before us, by Alexander Mack, by St. Francis. It's a path that has been walked by the Magi. It's essentially a path that leads us closer to Jesus. Amen.